Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this presentation on the Paycheck Protection Program and Important CARES Act and benefits to help you and your clients. My name is Andrea Terry, the Director of Learning for the Maryland State Bar Association, and we thank our taxation section for bringing together this panel of terrifically knowledgeable attorneys. They're going to provide some insight into this timely and rather urgent topic, honestly, for the CARES Act. Glenn Frost with Frost Law will be our moderator today, and he's joined by Janice Shee with the Maryland Volunteer Lawyers Service, Matt Kreuter and Eli Knopf, also attorneys with Frost Law. The registration notice that went out for this program, some of you might have noticed, invited questions to be submitted ahead of time. And I believe we have 20 or so already that faculty have reviewed. And you'll also be able to submit questions during this presentation by emailing them to our educational program coordinator, Chriselle, at msba.org. And her email address will appear on the slide for your reference as well. So thank you all. And with that, I will turn the program over to Glenn Frost.
All right. Thank you, Andrea, for having us. I wanted to introduce our co-panelists. First is Janice Shee of the Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Services. Janice is also on the Section Council for taxation of the Maryland State Bar. She's on the council with me as well. Also wanted to introduce my law partner, Eli Knopf. Eli focuses his practice primarily on tax controversy matters, and he'll be coming at you with that perspective today. And finally, my other law partner, Matthew Kreuter. Matt is a business transactional lawyer as well as a business litigator, and he'll be coming from the perspective of business law today. So with that, Janice, I'll let you lead off. Unmute your mic, Janice.
Thank you. Thanks. That's why you're the moderator. Well, great. Thank you. As Glenn said, I'm Janice Shee, and I'm the director of the Low Income Taxpayer Clinic at Maryland Volunteer Lawyers Service. The meat of this topic is really going to focus on businesses, but we thought we'd throw in a little bit of information about individuals because this may be something that your clients will come and ask you about, as well as questions that you might have for yourself. So next slide, please, Bill. So the biggest question that everyone is hearing about is the 2020 Recovery Rebate Tax Credit, or the tax stimulus check. I've added this link in for people to go and see information if you'd like. This is updated pretty regularly, but really the question comes down to how does it affect you? So this will provide $1,200 to single individuals and $2,400 to married couples who file jointly. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, Bill, next slide. There we go. So there is some eligibility criteria here. In order to receive this tax stimulus check, you need to have a Social Security number authorizing work. For a married filing jointly couple, both individuals must have a valid Social Security number authorizing work. One exception to this rule is if one spouse of a married filing jointly couple is a member of the armed forces, only one of the spouses need to have a valid Social Security number authorizing work. There is an income criteria. If you're single, you must earn under $75,000. If you're married filing jointly, you must earn under $150,000. Or if you're filing as a head of household, you must earn less than $112,500. So if you earn more than these thresholds, you will receive $5 less for every $100 above these thresholds. However, there is a point in which individuals with income greater than $99,000 or couples with income greater than $198,000 will not receive this payment. But they might still receive some payment for any qualifying children. And we'll see that on the next slide. And finally, you cannot be claimed as a dependent on another's tax return for 2020. Next slide, Bill. Great. So the next question is, if you have children, you will receive an additional $500 for each qualifying child. There is no limit to the number of qualifying children, but there are specific criteria which are listed here. Next slide, Bill. So how does the government know how much you're going to be receiving? They're going to be looking at your 2019 tax return. And if they don't have a 2019 tax return, then they'll be looking at your 2018, but nothing earlier than that. So the key takeaway here is that you should file your 2019 tax return as soon as you can. However, there is a caveat that if your 2019 income is higher than 2018, you may want to consider whether the difference in income will affect the amount of your recovery rebate. So just something to kind of keep in mind. Next slide, please. Oops. Uh-oh. So when will you get the check and how? So the government is eager to send these out as soon as possible. And for those individuals that have a bank account listed on their 2019 or 2018 tax return, those checks will be deposited into bank accounts. And if not, then they'll mail you a check. So of course, mail checks are going to take longer. I believe the IRS is working on developing a web-based portal where you can enter direct deposit information if they don't already have that. It's not ready yet, but it's something that they've been talking about. Next step, next file. Next slide, please, Bill. So what if you don't need to file a return since your only income is Social Security? Those individuals don't really need to do anything at this point because the IRS is going to be obtaining information from the Social Security Administration, and you should be receiving your check the same way that you receive your Social Security payment. But there's a large group of people who receive SSI or SSDI who don't, who may not be able to have that information shared. So I think that's an area that they're still trying to decide what to do with. So next slide, please. One question we're getting a lot of is that if you owe back taxes, will you still get your check? And the answer should be yes. Even if you owe back taxes to the IRS, the check amount will not be reduced because it's considered a refundable tax credit. So it's not considered gross income or taxable income. The one caveat is that if you do owe child support, that check may be applied towards that. Okay, next slide, please. All right. So one other thing, now we're going to move on to a different topic that also came out of the CARES Act, and that is the required minimum distribution. You can make withdrawals from your retirement accounts up to $100,000 now without incurring the 10% early withdrawal penalty. But also remember that the amount that you withdraw is considered income, so it is taxable. So.
And I'll chime in as well, Janice.
Yeah.
There is the ability for this one to repay it within that 3-year period. So you might be able to defer your income or eliminate income altogether if you repay it. It's not exactly clear how that's going to work yet, but there is the ability to put the money back into your IRA so you won't incur tax.
Yeah, great. Thank you. It's an important point to know. So thanks. Next slide, Bill. Okay. Oh, and also one more thing from the CARES Act is that charitable contributions. This is a point that is hopefully encouraging people to donate. It allows an above the line deduction of $300 for cash contributions. And what that means is that you don't have to itemize this charitable contribution in order to get the tax benefit. So, great. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to move on now to the People First Initiative, which is an act the IRS is promoting to help taxpayers and provide relief. For those of you who are not tax attorneys listening, this may not be so important to you, but it's sort of more a broad general information that I think it's important for everybody to know. Next slide, please. So anyone who has an existing installment agreement, payments due between April 4th and July 15th are now suspended, and the IRS will not default any installment agreements during this period. However, interest will continue to accrue in any unpaid balances. Next slide, Bill. Great. There are some changes in offers and compromise applications, and as well as current offers and compromises, and that's listed there. Next slide, Bill. There's also
Janice, I'll just jump in for a quick second on suspending installment agreements. So the IRS has put out their guidance on the People First Initiative through July 15th, but the Comptroller of Maryland, you have to request it, but they're also suspending installment agreement payments until July 1st, but you have to actually request it. So we've been receiving a lot of requests from many taxpayers who have Maryland installment agreements to put them on suspension as well. It's not automatic. You have to request it, but the comptroller is offering it. They're reduced staff. So if you want to try to reach somebody, I can share some contact information for people that are still working offline. So back to you, Janice.
And with regard to the federal installment agreements, if you're in a direct debit installment agreement, you should contact your bank to have them stop making the withdrawals from your bank. The IRS doesn't have the ability to do that on their side.
Great points. Thank you. Thanks. Okay. Next slide, Bill. Great. One other thing of great importance is for the IRS, automated liens and levies will be suspended during this period, so that buys some time. And then I've also added some information about Maryland here. Maryland is also not going to send out any lien warning notices or issue any liens here. This comes from the Maryland Tax Alert from April 1st, 20. And there's some email addresses also for people to contact during this. So, great. Next slide, please, Bill. Okay. Passport certification to the State Department. Previously, the IRS would send information to the Department of State for taxpayers who were seriously delinquent, and passports would be held. Seriously delinquent is usually if you owe more than $50,000 in back taxes, but this is going to be suspended for this time period as well. Great. Very good. Next slide, please, Bill. Great. As far as any audits, the IRS is not going to start any new field, office, or correspondence exams. However, they may start some new exams where they deem it necessary to protect the government's interest. Next slide, please. The Independent Office of Appeals is going to continue to be open. Many of the offices in the IRS are starting to work remotely, and so the staffing is reduced as well. So there is some changes here. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Great. And so I'm going to just finish up with a couple of IRS updates here. IRS mission critical operations will continue, but there is no face-to-face assistance. And this is the website or a link for some additional information, and it's constantly being updated. Next slide, please, Bill. For those of you practitioners out there, the practitioner priority services is now closed. So that is going to limit some of the interactions that you have here. Next slide, please, Bill. Status of the IRS phone lines is dependent on it depends on which department you're trying to reach. Some of them are available. Again, I think many of the staff is working remotely, and so some are still available, but some are not. Next slide, please, Bill. And then CAF units, the centralized authorization file unit. All of them there are currently not any CAF processing sites that are open right now. So that is going to make things a little bit more challenging right now. Next slide, please, Bill. Taxpayer Advocate Service is open in certain states. Our local taxpayer advocate is still open. However, they are only open to receiving phone calls via the local numbers right now. And then finally, next slide, please, Bill. There are some temporary IRS changes to document signatures and transmissions. So, great. Very good. Next slide, Bill. Thank you. So that's the end of my portion. I just wanted to encourage everybody to follow us on social media. We are updating regularly with in our blog as well as on our Facebook page with new changes that will affect individual taxpayers. And we do welcome you to join us. Next slide, please. Great. So I do want to encourage everyone to remember that as difficult a time as this is for people, there are still clients who still need assistance, and you can still help them. So if you're not a volunteer, we do encourage you to sign up today. Next slide, please. Great. So even if you're not a tax attorney, MBLS does offer legal assistance in all of these areas. So we certainly do encourage you to join us if you would like to work on a case in any of those areas. Next slide, Bill. Great. A way to find cases is to go to our pro bono portal. Next slide, please. Great. And here's a picture of it. So the cases are categorized according to the type of cases. And so it's very easy for people to look it up, especially when you are bored and looking for something to do. Please look at our portal and look for a case to take on. People still need a lot of help, especially during this very unusual time. So great. So I'm going to turn it over now back to Glenn and for the real part of this discussion. Thanks.
All right, excellent. Hey, Matt, we can't really see you very well or whether or not you have clothes on or not. So can you adjust your camera?
Can you see me now?
I see you just fine now. So Excellent.
And I
So
do have clothes on for anybody that's listening.
pants too, or just the shirt? Okay, the next part of this program is going to be hosted by Matt Kreuter. He's going to talk about emergency paid sick leave and some other provisions in the CARES Act. You can
Sure. You want me to jump in on that?
Yeah, go ahead, Eli.
All right, sounds good. Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks again for joining today. We know these are really difficult times, and we look forward to sharing better days ahead and seeing everybody at the events. There's a lot of new information coming out daily here. There's information every 24 hours. There's new info coming out, multiple rounds of information that clarify different nuances within these rules. This presentation, we were projected to really give it next week, so we threw this together in 24 hours, so bear with us here. We did the best we could. We chose select information that we feel is the most relevant and that we're getting the most questions on. Obviously, the bill has a lot of other information in there that could be beneficial to some of your clients. I'd urge everybody to at least skim through the table of contents in the actual bill itself, which is quite easy to navigate through. And without further ado, we'll go through, before we get into CARES, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the FFCRA stuff. So next slide, please, Bill. You could just go through. These are all of our profile slides. Yep, there we go. So we're going to talk about the emergency paid sick leave. So just some information necessary for attorneys to know to guide their businesses or clients that are businesses. So this is under the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, FFCRA. Next slide, please, Bill. What this essentially does is it puts in place paid sick leave where private employers with less than 500 employees and all government entities have to provide paid sick leave to any employees who are unable to work or even telework because of illness or quarantine if such employee is either ordered into coronavirus quarantine or isolation, has been advised by a healthcare provider or self-quarantine in lieu of coronavirus concern, experiencing coronavirus symptoms and is pursuing a medical diagnosis. So these first three are really geared towards that particular individual symptoms and their personal quarantine. The next three are caring for someone else described in 1 or 2 above, caring for a minor child whose school or childcare location is closed because of coronavirus concerns. So that applies obviously to a lot of us here at home. You may even hear, 4 barbarians at the gate trying to break down my office door throughout this process. But that's the child care, number 5. And then number 6 is a catch-all, experiencing any other substantially similar conditions specified by the Secretary of Health and Human Services in consultation with the Secretary of the Treasury or Secretary of Labor. So basically it provides sick leave to employees. Employers have to provide the sick leave under 500 employees on these 6 for these 6 specific categories. Now we'll talk about what that paid sick leave looks like. Can we go to the next slide, please, Bill? So the duration of the leave. So for full-time, again, this is the paid sick leave. Full-time employees are eligible to receive up to 10 days or 80 hours of paid sick leave. So if they're full-time, 80 hours over 2 weeks, they can get paid the full 80 hours. They're eligible for all of it. But for part-time employees, they're only eligible for leave, which is equivalent to the average hours worked in a 2-week period. So it's basically prorated down to however many hours they work. So full-time get full-time hours. Part-time people, it's however many hours. If it's 20 hours a week, then it's 40 hours over the 2-week period of paid sick leave they're eligible for. So how do you figure out how much you have to pay or how much an employer has to pay an employee for paid sick leave? So the answer to that is it depends on what the reason for the sick leave is. So remember on the slide before, there were 6 reasons, right? So the first 1 through 3 were essentially particularly to that individual. So number 1, thank you, Bill. So number 1, 2, and 3 are really that person has to quarantine. They've been told to quarantine. They have some issues. They're experiencing problems. So those 3 categories, you'll be paid at the greater amount of either their regular rate or the applicable minimum wage, up to $511 per day. So it's maxed at $511 a day to aggregate $5,110 over 2 weeks, right? So it's 80 hours and it's 10 business days times 511. So it's for $5,110 max. So obviously as you'll see in the second bullet point in a second, the government's essentially giving preferential treatment to people that have to be away because of reason 1 through 3. Now, if reasons 4 through 6, primarily 4 and 5, are employees that have to be home because of caring for someone who's ill or childcare, then they will be receiving 2/3, the greater amount of either 2/3 the regular rate of pay or up to $200 per day. So you can see how that's a lot less money, up to $2,000 maximum over that period of time. So we'll move on, Bill, to the next slide. So that's basically paid sick leave. The FFCRA also put in place Emergency Family and Medical Leave Act, EFMLA, and it's basically extended some of those principles. Next slide, please, Bill. So private employers with less than 500 employees essentially allows 12 weeks of FMLA. So the way we're typically familiar with FMLA, that they basically expanded that further for any employee who's been employed for a minimum of 30 days. They have to have been on staff for 30 days, and they can't work or telework because they have to care for a child or the school closure issues. So it basically applies the amount of money that you can receive, that the first 10 days can be unpaid. But after that, the leave is paid at 2/3 rate of the regular pay, similar to reasons 4 through 6 in the prior paid sick leave rules. The amount is capped at $200 per day or $12,000 in the aggregate for that period of time. So that's just something to know from the labor law side. There are posts that, you do have to put up a placard up at work or distribute it around to your employees, or employers have to distribute it to their employees to make sure that they're aware of these laws so they're complying. And that's basically the paid sick leave and EFMLA. Next slide, please. So there's an exemption for businesses with fewer than 50 employees. There's specific ways to opt out of it, but you have to essentially show that the business has to be able to demonstrate that the leave requirements would jeopardize the viability of the business as a going concern in order to exempt out of this. There are some specific rules and requirements which are a little bit outside of this, but something to know, something to be aware of. And certainly we can circulate some more specific information on that if anybody asks us for offline. Next slide, Bill. All right, Glenn, you want to take over some payroll tax credits?
I'll pick that up. I'm seeing a lot of questions pour in. We're going to have probably 20 to 30 minutes at the end of the presentation to address most of those questions. If we don't address them on the presentation, certainly ask us and we'll get to them offline. So there's some tax provisions for employers that they can qualify for a significant tax benefit, both a payroll tax credit and a tax deferral of the employer's share of the FICA tax. Now, you've all heard of the Paycheck Protection Program as well. You can't double dip. You can't take the Paycheck Protection Program loan and these tax credits. You have to pick one or the other. So the first credit under Section 2301 allows a 50% credit for up to $10,000 of wages paid to each employee. So that equates to approximately a $5,000 credit per employee. And next slide, Bill. And here it is right here. Next slide, Bill. So the law has in it a provision about 100 full-time employees. It's supposed to treat it differently if it's over 100 employees or below 100 employees. Below 100 employees, all wages qualify. Above 100 employees, the business has to be fully or partially shut down. And my analysis of that is, at this moment in time, I think almost every business can say that they have suffered a partial shutdown due to this, the things going on. Next slide, Bill. This is an extension of time to pay payroll taxes. Again, it's the employer share of the FICA tax. So next slide, Bill. On the employer's 941 tax return, for the rest of 2020, they do not need to pay the employer share of the FICA tax. They can defer it until 2021 and 2022, and they have to repay it in those years in equal installments. And next slide.
I'll just jump in quick for a second because I'm seeing some questions run through, and again, we'll try to hit everybody on the end. But this goes back to the paid sick leave, the FMLA, and then to what Glenn just discussed, the payroll tax credits. So these are credits against the payroll taxes. And question that people have, and this is a question that I had early on as well, is that, well, what happens if I don't have enough payroll tax to cover that payment that I'm making to the employee, right? Because the employer tax is only 6.2%. And there is actually, the IRS put out a form several days ago. It's a form 7200. And essentially what that is, it's a way to request an express refund from Treasury to be able to have enough money to cover those expenses. Because you are right, 6.2% of payroll, depending how large your payroll is, can potentially not cover the amount of money that you're paying out under paid sick leave, the FMLA, or payroll tax credit. So what you want to make sure is that you have enough money in the kitty. And there's a form 7200. I'd urge everyone to Google that and take a look at it. So off to you, Matt.
Thanks, Eli. The next thing we're going to discuss is the economic injury and disaster loan. And this is the one that really hasn't gotten as much press recently for a variety of reasons, but it's actually a program that's been in place for a long time for places that are declared a disaster area, like a hurricane or another issue like that. What happened recently was they expanded, the entire country is now a national disaster area. So that was an important step to say that anybody within these within the United States can apply for one of these loans. If you want to get the next slide. And secondly, and more importantly, they allowed for a $10,000 advance or grant that was available, so that if you apply for the economic injury disaster loan, you could get $10,000 up front. That was did not have to be repayable. I see on the slide here that it's supposed to be distributed within 3 days. I will 2 points on that. One, from a practical standpoint, that has just not been happening. The SBA, in my understanding, processed as many loans in 2 days as it did the entire last year. So the SBA is completely overwhelmed with loans and applications aside from the PPP program. And interestingly, I went back onto the website, and the SBA has conveniently removed all of the language about being able to provide this $10,000 advance within 3 days. So I think that the practical realities of that are coming to light at the SBA. Different from the PPP, which is an SBA guaranteed loan. This is actually direct from the SBA, so you would apply directly to the SBA for this loan. You want to do the next slide? So fewer than 500 employees is the standard. There's a lot of discussion, and we can talk about it later with respect to the PPP loan. But this 500 or fewer employees number has caused some confusion for some of the mid-sized businesses. That's the default standard, is 500 employees. But under the regulations for the SBA, the affiliation regulations, the regulations that apply are specific to what they call a 7A loan, which is this EIDL loan. And under that regulation, it would be the greater of 500 employees or the size standard for your NAICS code, which is your industry standard code. So if you have a standard like boat building is a good example, is 1,000 employee standard. So you can apply and still be small under that other standard. So there was a little bit of confusion there. It does cover sole proprietors and independent contractors, which is important. So if you have people that operate as 1099 employees or gig workers, they can apply for this program. The standard is that you have to prove a substantial economic injury, and I think in these days it's fairly straightforward to be able to demonstrate to the SBA. All that being said, we have heard and we've seen on the Maryland Lawyers Facebook group and a bunch of other forums that people are just not getting the loans through this program. And I know that there's a lot happening in DC right now, and I'm certain that they're trying to push them through. One of the big problems that they're having, is our understanding, is that there's a lot of nefarious activity with respect to these loans, especially when the $10,000 grant came, that there was the ability to grab cash quickly if they could. So it created a lot of bad actors. Next slide. The interest rates, it's a 3.75% rate for businesses. You do get a deferral period, and the repayment rate is quite long. Importantly, and I think Glenn will discuss this in a moment with respect to the PPP, is that you can apply for both loans. You can apply for an EIDL loan and a PPP loan. You can't have the $10,000 in both. And again, Glenn will shed a little bit more light into this. But what's important is that you can get the EIDL loan and actually refinance it through the PPP to reduce your rate, because the rate under the PPP is less than 3.75. Next slide. You good, Glenn?
Yeah, I've got a couple of practical pointers on the EIDL loan. And so when you're applying, they ask for 2 years of financial statements that you're supposed to provide, as well as a pro forma 6-month financial statement projecting, what your losses are going to be the next 6 months. It's almost a pre-application that's filled out. It's not even the application for the EIDL loan itself. It's really an application for the grant that you're filling out. And we just got our first response yesterday. A client got a response, and they said they're going to be administering a $1,000 grant per employee. So I'm assuming self-employed individuals would get a $1,000 grant. And then if you have at least 10, that's how you would qualify for the $10,000 grant. But I don't know how reliable that information is, but that's what we heard yesterday. Eli, you want to take this PPP program?
Sure. So, I think this is kind of the crown jewel of the bill, essentially. And essentially what we're getting a lot of calls about every single day is the Paycheck Protection Program. So we'll go through, I know there's going to be a lot of questions about this. There isn't guidance covering every single aspect of it yet, but, we're going to do the best we can. There were some FAQs that came out late Monday evening, I believe, and I tried to incorporate that into the slides last night and stick that all in there. So I think that should cover a lot of the questions we received before the seminar, and also some of the questions that may be asked now. So we'll go forward. Bill, next slide, please. So as everyone largely knows now, the PPP provides an incentive for companies to keep people on payroll, keep them employed during this period of time. The PPP makes available $349 billion in loans of funds available to financial institutions to be able to lend. As Matt mentioned earlier, in the EIDL loans are coming from the SBA directly, whereas these PPP loans are coming off of the balance sheet of the banks. So initially, there was a lot of hesitation for banks. They created, I think you saw this with certain banks, where they limited who can apply through them. And they limited them to people that may have existing relationships with the bank, but beyond that, also existing lending relationships. Because if the bank is making the loan, it was initially at 0.5% interest. And the government's heard those concerns and raised it to 1%. There was some concern that because these are up to 2-year loans, the bank was concerned, well, what happens if the loan doesn't get forgiven? What if the government comes down with a hard hand with respect to who can have these loans forgiven? They're left holding a loan for a couple of years worth of time on their books for 0.5% interest, which has since been increased to 1%. I think the government's been trying to do their part in trying to ease the concerns of the financial institutions to have the funds flow a little looser. And beyond that $350 billion, there are talks now of a second tranche of, I believe it's $250 billion, if I'm right. They're looking for a potential another round of funding to the extent this will be exhausted, which we assume it will be exhausted rather quickly. Matt, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, there's one more consideration that the banks had, and it was the know your client requirements for anti-money laundering. And I don't believe that any of those were eased as part of this program. So banks were concerned. I know Bank of America got a lot of heat recently about not providing the PPP loan for customers that didn't currently have a credit facility with them, even a credit card. And I think that really went more towards their documentation requirements under the Know Your Client rules more than anything else. And so it'll be interesting to see where that goes in the future. Obviously, there's a prominent firm in town that's leading the charge on that. And I know Bank of America pivoted over the weekend and is now opening up to other clients that don't currently have credit, but I don't believe that they're going outside of their client base just yet.
That's a good point, Matt. Right. They are concerned about AML and BSA requirements, and just taking an application, which if you've seen the application, it's very short. The information that needs to be completed, again, it's very quick. I think the government was true to its word in that they wanted to get money out quick, and they put this short application together. But of course, as Matt just pointed out, there are some serious concerns about just sending money out to people you don't know. Loans have to be used to pay for payroll, which is Paycheck Protection Program, right? So it's essentially largely payroll, rent, health benefits, utilities, and other expenses. And we'll dig deeper down into the forgiveness side and all of that in future slides. So Bill, next slide, please. So who's eligible? Won't go too much into the detail here, but it's essentially small business concerns and businesses with 500 or less employees, or if they have more than 500 employees, they may be eligible as well. Hotels and restaurants, sole proprietorships, independent contractors, and self-employed individuals. That's a hot item that we'll touch on today. A lot of people have questions about how 1099s work into the calculation of the maximum loan amount. Should they have applied last Friday? Do they apply next Friday? We're going to answer those questions. Veterans organizations, tribal business concerns, they're all eligible for PPP. Next slide. So the loan amount. Let's talk about the loan amount on a high level, and then let's drill down into the various components of this formula. So how much money can you borrow? So you could borrow the lesser of $10 million, or the average total monthly payments by the applicant for payroll costs. So basically average monthly payroll incurred during the 1-year period prior to the date on which the loan is made. We'll talk about what that is prior to the 1-year period in the next slide. But basically average monthly payroll for the last year multiplied by 2.5, and then it's limited by the previous amount of loans that you've taken, idle loans. So that goes to the cap of what can be borrowed. But basically, we'll talk about what that formula is, but it's average monthly times payroll times 2.5. What's considered payroll costs? What's the 1-year look back? Those are questions we're going to answer in a minute. Payment deferral for the first 6 months, including interest, principal, and fees. But interest will continue to accrue during that deferral. So you can defer payments for 6 months. The interest rate on the loans were initially 0.5%. But again, banks were concerned that they weren't going to make enough, or they were carrying this, so that they might have to carry this beyond the forgiveness period if somebody doesn't spend the money appropriately. So they put 1%, they raised the interest from 0.5% to 1% for those particular loans.
And there's a practical point here with as Matt previously indicated, with the idle loan, you can refinance any outstanding idle loan into your PPP loan. So if you remember, the idle loan interest rate was 3.75% for for-profit companies, whereas the PPP loan is 1% with the potential of getting it forgiven. With regard to the idle grant, the amount of your idle grant will reduce your PPP forgiveness later on, and Eli will cover that.
Okay, so let's, thanks, Glenn. Let's go to the next slide, Bill. So let's define what payroll costs means. So, right, we said the average monthly payroll cost. What is payroll cost? So that little a, two little b, that's actually from the code itself, the law itself. So I pulled that from there. So payroll cost means the sum of payments of any compensation with respect to employees that is a salary, wage, commission, or similar compensation. That in and of itself has opened up a lot of interpretation and confusion. Payment of cash tip or equivalent, vacation, parental, family, medical, or sick leave, allowance for dismissal, separation, payment required for the provision of group health care benefits, including insurance premiums, payments of any retirement benefits, state or local tax assessed on the compensation of employees. That's all part of payroll costs. So when you're considering what the average monthly payroll cost is, that all goes in there. And then there's the next section, which caused a lot of questions about, well, how do independent contractors, sole proprietors, how do they play in? So the sum of payments of any compensation to or income of a sole proprietor or independent contractor that is a wage, commission, income, net earnings from self-employment or similar compensation, and that is in an amount that is not more than $100,000 in 1 year as prorated for the covered period. So for purposes of independent contractors, just to answer that question, you cannot include independent contractors in average payroll cost analysis. They are not included. So if you pay somebody, a 1099 and we're assuming you have payroll right now, so you have lots of employees, and there's also some individuals that receive 1099 compensation. The people that are paid 1099 are not included in the average payroll costs. They can file for their own PPP loan. So, and that goes to sole proprietors in general. The program that opened this last Friday, just to go high level, the program that opened this last Friday is essentially a program that deals with people that have businesses that have payroll. So what's included in there is your typical payroll compensation. That does not include 1099s. It includes wages and salaries. So that's what that includes. This coming Friday, they're opening up the applications to self-employed individuals. Now, what does that look like? What are the requirements going to be? I think they've been chasing their tail, trying to deal a lot with all the questions for last Friday's program that I haven't yet seen any significant guidance on the upcoming one. Namely, for this particular PPP program, big picture, you get the loan, you spend it on the eligible expenses, and then it gets forgiven. It's easy to prove how a bucket of money was used to pay payroll, right? Now, for someone who's self-employed and they just have net income on a Schedule C on their tax return, and they have 50,000 of net income, let's say, for example, or let's just say 100,000 to make it easy, they get a loan of about 20,000, 2.5 times the $8,300, which is the average monthly payroll cost. What do they do with that? Do they just keep it? They don't wage themselves. They don't issue W-2. So there's a lot of questions there that are going to come up. But fundamental point here on this slide, wages, that's what included in payroll costs. Independent contractors, no. Independent contractor 1099 that you receive is not going to be, independent contractors that you pay are not going to be included in that average monthly payroll cost. Glenn, do you have a point to add?
Yeah, and what I've been seeing the banks do is for employer costs, they've been using box 2 of the 941s. And you can either, it's the borrower's option, you can either choose the last 12 months, so effectively second, third, fourth quarter of 19 and first quarter of 2020, or you can use the 2019 tax year, so the 4 quarters of 2019. But it's been box 2 of the 941 is what they've been considering wages and salary, and no 1099.
So basically, good point. So basically, what's the 1 year period for purposes of the average payroll cost look back? And that we said it's average payroll costs over the last year. Now, the law says the last year. The SBA guidance is in 2019. So it's either the last 12 months or it's 2019, and it'll largely depend on the financial institution that you're submitting to as to what they're going to require. But you can choose either or, last 12 months or 2019, whichever works out more beneficial. And we'll talk about look back periods a little bit more in some of the next slides. But payroll costs defined. This slide is essentially defining what payroll costs are. So it's salary, wages, commissions, similar types of payment, excludes 1099 recipients. Can we go to the next slide, please, Bill? So this is where a lot of the confusion came in early on, and we'll actually have a slide dedicated to answer some of these questions. But what payroll costs shall not include are any compensation to an individual employee in excess of 100K. So it's prorated for the covered period. So basically, you can't use, for purposes of determining the loan amount on the front end or the loan forgiveness on how you spend the money on the back end, you can't compute more than $100,000 in wages. So for example, if you have an employee who is receiving $200,000, you have to, when computing the average monthly payroll and multiplying that by the 2.5 factor, you have to reduce and throttle back that payroll to $100,000 annualized divide that out over 12 months. So that comes out to about $8,333 a month. So it's essentially the cap that you can receive for an employee on the loan amount. However, there are some exceptions to that, which includes certain benefits, which we'll discuss on a later slide, which allows you to push over that $8,333, that $100,000 limit. So basic principle here is a $100,000 cap on the maximum loan amount determination for payroll costs. And then that same definition for payroll costs will be used on the back end for forgiveness on how you spend the money as well. Now, this next bullet point caused a lot of confusion, but payroll costs shall not include taxes withheld under Chapter 21, 22, or 24. We'll skip 22 for a second because it's largely not applicable, but Chapter 21 deals with employer share FICA. Chapter 24 deals with withholding, employee income tax withholdings. So it was unclear how you determine the maximum loan amount on the front end. Do you take gross payroll, net payroll? Because it seems like this: you take net payroll, you take payroll minus FICA, you take payroll minus the employee's withholding, and that's how you determine the loan. But if you do that, you have a client that's going to be out of pocket. So essentially, what would happen is they'd have to take a loan on the net payroll, and where are they going to come up with the money to pay the employees' withholdings, for example? So it caused a little bit of an issue with respect to liquidity. Now, since then, on Monday evening, there's FAQs that have been released that answer this question. It's going to be on a later slide, but the essential answer is, not to wait while we're talking about it. We may as well attack it. That basically, the taxes, the excluded amount for purposes of determining payroll costs, for average monthly payroll costs on the front end when determining the loan, what's excluded is FICA. So the employer share payroll. You cannot include that in the loan amount. You can include the employee's withholdings. So that is includable. So that solves the problem a little bit, although the employer still has to come out of pocket for the FICA and cannot use the loan money, cannot borrow that money by including the FICA in the loan amount in the average monthly payroll times 2.5. Therefore, he's not going to be borrowing, the business is not going to be borrowing that FICA money. On the back end, though, they're still going to have to pay it to they can't use that money they borrow to then pay the FICA either for it to be forgiven. They can pay the employees withholding under Chapter 24, but they cannot use it to pay FICA. But again, it's a 2.5 factor times average monthly payroll, and you have to spend it within 8 weeks. So the loan obviously does give businesses a little bit more money, a little bit more cushion, that extra 0.5 factor to be able to cover rent expenses, utilities, and mortgage interest, and mortgage obligations. So when you have that extra money on the side, that helps to largely offset a lot of the FICA payroll costs that the employer is going to have to come out of pocket with. This was a question I think I saw early on as well. The next bullet point: payroll shall not include payroll cost does not include any compensation of an employee whose principal place of residence, is outside of the United States. So if they live outside the United States principally, then they're not eligible to be counted in the payroll costs. And then, as we discuss generally throughout this, you can't double dip. Can't double dip on the FFCRA. That's bullet point 4 and 5. Can't double dip and get paid sick leave. Use the payroll tax money to be able to pay people for paid sick leave under the FFCRA, which we started off on, or to pay the EFMLA by using payroll tax money, taking the payroll tax money instead of remitting it to the government, using that to pay people, and then double dip and get the PPP loan and include those same employees in your average monthly payroll. You can't do that. And that goes also for the payroll tax credit that Glenn talked about earlier, which is essentially you can't take payroll tax, the same principle, where you can take up to $5,000, 50% up to $10,000 of an employee's wages and take that money, $5,000 out of payroll taxes, and pay an employee with it. So that's double dipping. So your payroll costs are reduced by any money that was used, any other benefits that were used under FFCRA or CARES Act for payroll tax credits. So that's payroll costs defined. This is very driven, the formula, on average monthly payroll costs. So now that we know what payroll costs are, that same definition is used for forgiveness on the back end. If you use the money on payroll costs, so it's all the same definition that fits in. Can't pay people with 1099s in order for it to be forgiven. Remember, this is a loan. You can hold on to this loan for 2 years at 1%. That's not bad. But most people that are applying for this are applying for this because there's forgiveness. And it's basically and essentially a large grant to a business at the end of the day. And if you're looking for it to be forgiven, you want to make sure that you spend it properly and you understand what payroll costs are, and so that you don't trip anything up. So let's move Bill to the next slide, if you don't mind. So this was one of the questions in the FAQ. So I left it as a Q&A, and I tweaked it a little bit, but it's largely the same language. Q&A, and this is a lot of questions that we received so far pre-seminar, and I think some of them now as well, although I'm having trouble managing looking at them and speaking at the same time. The question is, the CARES Act excludes from the definition of payroll costs any employee compensation in excess of an annual salary of $100,000, right? So we said that's $100,000 annualized. So when you determine the max loan amount, you're doing the average payroll capped at $100,000 per employee. So that's $8,333. Now, does that exclusion apply to all employee benefits of monetary value, meaning healthcare benefits, retirement benefits that are paid in? Are those included in that $100,000 annualized, or is that above it? And the answer is no. The exclusion of compensation in excess of $100,000 annually applies only to cash compensation, money in the employee's hands, not to non-cash benefits, including, and what are non-cash benefits? Employer contributions to defined benefit or defined contribution retirement plans. So you can include, let's do the next ones first, and we'll talk about what that includes. Payment for the provision of employee benefits consisting of group health care, including insurance premiums, and payment of state and local taxes assessed on the compensation of employees. So essentially the $100,000 annualized is $100,000 plus these other expenses as well, which you can add into the average payroll cost computation. So that's basically one of the Q&A questions, the FAQ questions that I think really answers some of the questions that were asked early on, and possibly even in some of the questions that are in the chat. Let's go to the next slide. Payroll cost defined, another great question. So a lot of the questions we received were addressed in the FAQ released Monday evening. So I figured I'd copy paste them in here. I've modified them a little bit, but how should a borrower account for federal taxes when determining its payroll cost for purposes of the maximum loan amount allowable use of a PPP loan and the amount of a loan that may be forgiven? So if you remember, you don't have to go back a few slides, Bill, but the point is, if you remember how we discussed average payroll costs in previous slides, it basically goes to the $100,000 right there. That's great, Bill. See, oh, no, right there. So your second bullet point says taxes imposed or withheld under chapters 21, 22, 24, which made it seem like you had to make the determination on net payroll. But back to the current slide, Bill, if you don't mind. This FAQ essentially answers the question. Payroll costs are not reduced by taxes imposed on an employee, which would be Chapter 24, and required to be withheld by the employer, but payroll costs do not include the employer share of payroll tax. So that's employer share FICA. That was Chapter 21 of the code. So essentially that employer share FICA is not included in payroll costs for determining the amount. This FAQ is basically addressing what we addressed earlier, is that basically in the average monthly payroll cost, you can include the withholdings that need to be withheld, and you can also spend the money on that withholding amount and have it be forgiven. What you cannot do is you cannot borrow the employer share FICA, and you cannot spend it on employer share FICA for it to be forgiven. And they gave a pretty good example. An employee who earned $4,000 per month in gross wages, from which $500 in federal taxes was withheld, right? So we as employers pay our employees, we give them a $4,000 check, but we have to withhold their federal taxes. The $4,000 in payroll counts as the payroll cost. The employee receives $3,500. $500 would be paid to the federal government. However, the employer side, right, the 6.2% payroll tax imposed on the 4,000 wages are excluded from determining what that average monthly payroll cost is. It's excluded from the definition of payroll costs altogether. So I think this really illustrates what is included in payroll costs for determining the maximum loan amount on the front end when you're looking at average monthly payroll. But it also gives us insight into what will be forgiven on the back end, because on the forgiveness section of the bill, it refers to the definitions in the same as the origination of the loan. So payroll cost defined. Next slide, Bill. So this goes to what Glenn was chiming in on earlier, which is basically how do you calculate your average monthly payroll? So we said it's over the last year. Well, what is the last year? So the bill discussed the last 12 months, and then the SBA came out with use 2019, and they're in conflict with each other. But essentially, it looks like some banks are asking for 12 months, some banks are asking for 2019, but I'd run it both ways just to see what's most beneficial for your particular circumstance. And then ultimately, if you're working with an existing lender, I think that's what you're going to have to go with. It may make a large difference, it may not, but that's something to keep in mind. For seasonal businesses, you can use the average monthly payroll for the period between February 15th or March 1 through June 30th of 19. So that might yield a better result for some seasonal businesses, but you might want to run that through. Applicants that were not in business from those periods of time of February 15th, 2019 to June 30th, 2019, because you can use the PPP, I believe, as long as you were in business in February 15th of 2020. So if you were in business February 15th of 2020, then what if you weren't in business and you're seasonal between February 15th of 2019 and June 30th, 2019, then you can use the average monthly payroll cost for the period of January 1, 2020 through February 29th, 2020. So it just gives you a little bit different of a period there to look at. Bill, can you hit the next slide? So there are certain certifications that have to be made. You can look at it in the application themselves, but I thought it'd be beneficial to talk a little bit about some of those certifications that have to be made. And some of the things that we don't have here present in front of us, to those of you who have not seen the application for the PPP, it asks essentially some of the things. It asks, is the business or any owner presently suspended, debarred, proposed for debarment, declared ineligible, voluntarily excluded for participation in this transaction by any federal department or agency? And then at the end of the sentence there, it says, or presently involved in any bankruptcy. So it's yes or no, right? And if questions 1 or 2, that was number 1 that I just read, are answered yes, the loan will not be approved. So something to know. If the business or any owner are currently involved in bankruptcy, then they won't be eligible. And unfortunately, that does affect some of our clients. Has the business, any of its owners or any business owned or controlled by any of them ever obtained a direct or guaranteed loan from the SBA or federal agency that's currently delinquent or has defaulted in the last 7 years and caused a loss to the government? You check yes on that, you're not going to be eligible for it. So I think those are a couple of things to know. There are some other questions. They want to know who owns 20% or greater of the business. They do ask questions about incarceration. If within the last 7 years for any felony or misdemeanor for a crime, I'm sorry, wrong question. Are you presently subject to an indictment, criminal information arraignment, or other means by which formal criminal proceedings are brought in any jurisdiction or presently incarcerated on probation or parole? So the FAQs do address, how far back this looks or how far back this goes. And I think that if you look at the FAQs, I believe there's a 5-year look back period, but you're going to want to look at those FAQs, which we can circulate around if you have a circumstance that would be relevant to. Now, beyond those initial questions, there are certifications that are going to be made on the back end of this loan. And the big one is the first point, and I think a lot of businesses are going to be able to answer this in good faith. It's current economic uncertainty makes the loan necessary to support ongoing operations. I mean, unless you're entirely immune to this, coronavirus pandemic, unless your business is entirely immune, which would be really hard to think about what business that would be. But if you're entirely immune to it, because even government contractors are calling me that there's new contracts aren't coming through, things have been slowed down. So it would be hard to see who's not impacted by this, but you'd have to certify that. And I think a lot of people can do that in good faith. Funds will be used to retain workers, maintain payroll, or make mortgage, lease, and utility payments. So you're limited as to what you're allowed to use the funds for. I don't know if I have a slide on this a little bit later or not, but basically 75% of the loan amount must be used on payroll costs. only 25% of the loan amount may be used on non-payroll costs, and that would include, the mortgage, the lease, and the utility payments, rent, those types of expenses, which are enumerated in the bill. So if you go ahead.
Eli, is that just for the forgiveness, or is that for the overall use of the proceeds?
So it's for purposes of the forgiveness on the back end.
Okay.
So as long as you spend it, and good question, Matt, because that goes to a lot of what people are applying for this for. They want to use this and they don't want to ever have to pay it back. And I think to the extent you can make that happen, I think that's obviously a fantastic result for clients. So they can only use up to 25% on expenses other than payroll in order for all of it to be forgiven. So that's a good point. And Matt, did you want to talk about just taking on additional debt? Did you talk about this earlier? Concerns about taking on additional debt and covenants and other obligations that the business might have?
Yeah, I'll mention a couple things. I was watching the questions as you were speaking there, Eli, and just to be clear, one of the questions popped up and said they had heard the PPP was a grant. And to be clear, the PPP is not a grant. It is going to be a new indebtedness to a private bank. You're going to sign a promissory note with a bank, and you're going to be obligated to repay that money. And what's important about that is that can trigger other issues with your current indebtedness, that if you have a current loan, and likely it may be with the same bank, or with a mortgage company or something, and you're taking on new indebtedness, you have to make sure that you're not defaulting on your current agreements with your banks by taking this new loan. So to be clear, this is not a grant. This is a loan to the bank that may be forgiven if the money is used for certain purposes, and the SBA will repay the loan for you. But this is not a grant. The only grants we've seen, there was a $10,000 grant from the state of Maryland, and the EIDL advance is essentially a grant if you get it, because it does not have to be repaid. But this specifically is a loan. So I just wanted to be clear about that. And to be clear, it is a new, like I said, it is a new indebtedness, and you have to understand the ramifications of that to make sure you're not defaulting on previous loans.
That's a good point. So, I'm looking through some of the questions. Maybe we'll knock out a couple quick ones here. How can information on Schedule C be used to apply for PPP? Again, that program's coming out this Friday for self-employed. We'll see how that works out and how that's going to be figured out, but it's largely probably going to be income minus expenses. That's how the bill contemplates it for purposes of determining that net for the PPP for self-employed. If you are self-employed now and have payroll, you can apply for this past Friday based on the payroll, or you can wait till next Friday to see if you can include yourself. It's unclear how that program is going to interplay if you have both employees and are receiving some net proceeds from the business as a Schedule C. That's some of the questions I saw there. Can you apply for EIDL and the PPP? Yes, but the EIDL will be offset. If you get the 10,000 EIDL, the PPP will be offset by the 10,000 EIDL that you ultimately do receive. So there isn't any necessarily a downside. Matt, you wanted to talk about that?
Yeah, I did. No, I wanted to address one of the other questions. There's a question that we love to see that says, can we hire you to help us do this? And under the law, we cannot. This is, we can provide some guidance, but in terms of filling out this loan, that is not something that we can charge legal fees for. There is, as part of the bill, this is specifically under the PPP program, there is an origination fee that the bank receives, and a portion of that can be paid to an agent that helped coordinate that loan. And I believe it's 1% or 0.5% or 1/4%, depending on the amount of the loan. But we are not allowed to charge specific legal fees for filling out these loans. Eli, I wanted to get you to answer one of the questions somebody asked. They said, do they have to spend all of this money within 8 weeks? And what's the time period to spend it? And if you
so it's 8 weeks from the origination, and they'd have to spend it within that 8-week period of time. So looking a lot more, there's going to be a lot more clarity that comes out on the forgiveness side. Right now, there's so many glitches on the application end, and I know a lot of people want to know, well, I don't want to take the loan unless I know for 100% certainty that all of it's going to be forgiven. But I think largely the idea is that there's going to be more information coming out on the forgiveness. But yes, they have to spend it within 8 weeks of origination, which seems to be when they get the money, but more guidance to come on that.
Right. And, and again, just to clarify, that's to just get it forgiven. If you just wanted to take the money and just pay the 1% loan back, you can do that. You're not required to spend it within the 8 weeks. But if you want the forgiveness part, you do have to spend it on those specific items, 75% of which is payroll costs, as was defined earlier, during that 8-week period.
And going back to what Matt said earlier about being able to charge for these types of things. So we can charge for modeling these types of programs out to see what's more beneficial between the payroll tax credits and between the PPP loans and all of that type of information. So we are helping people with that. I know a lot of practitioners are allergic to tax. So, essentially if there's something you need where we can go ahead and do that kind of analysis, we're glad to jump in and do that. We cannot charge to fill out the applications.
And there's going to be a lot of consulting services on figuring out how to get the largest portion of it forgiven and what costs can be forgiven, and making sure that that employer is planning during this process to get the maximum amount forgiven.
Right. And I guess we'll finish up some of the slides so we can jump into some of the other questions. Or Matt, do you have another point you wanted to mention?
Sure. One more point. In terms of filling out the loan, you really have to contact your bank. And that is your number one primary point of contact. Is your specific bank is going to be the one issuing this loan. The legislation currently says that all SBA lenders are able to give out these loans. Smaller banks are having some trouble trying to process these, so I'm sure some people are running into that. And as Eli had mentioned earlier, the banks are not rushing to find a bunch of clients to give these loans to, because there's just economically it may not make a lot of sense. So your current bank is really the person you want to contact.
And just so your hearts aren't bleeding too badly out there for the banks, I mean, they are receiving 5% up to 350,000 in loans, 3% from 350, I think, to 2 million, and I think 1% from 2 to 10 million for originating the loans. There are fees that agents can receive for working with the bank, although you probably have to negotiate with the bank itself. And I think banks are largely, especially the larger banks, I don't see them working with anybody to split their fee, but perhaps some of the community banks may be. But they are essentially allowed to provide, I believe, up to 350,000. They split the 5% as 4 and 1, 4 to the bank, 1 to the agent. And then it gets tiered, I believe, 0.5% and 0.25% for the other 2 tiers above that. So that's for purposes of hiring somebody to fill out the application. You can work with somebody who might be an agent linked up to a bank. It doesn't come out of the business's pocket. It comes out of the bank's fees. So you cannot charge anybody for these PPP application preparations. So Matt, you look like you're about to answer a question.
No, I was just going to say that to reinforce what Glenn was saying. It is very complicated, and trying to understand how to get all this information together is certainly something that you could use a professional for. But the actual filling out of the application, we can.
Yeah. And just to clarify, I saw a question. Our office has paralegals that are pretty familiar with this. If you need help with any of the calculations of payroll costs or any of the 401k information or anything of that nature that goes into the application, we can help with those calculations. We just can't fill out the form for you.
That's a good point. And the rest of these certifications are pretty much that you'll provide documentation and certify under penalties of perjury. So let's move past the certification. Let's move to a couple slides on forgiveness. I just want to be able to get through all these slides. There's only a few more, and then we'll turn it to any questions that haven't been answered through this. So the next slide is essentially the forgiveness, right? So left side of the screen, left side of the slide. A borrower will be eligible for loan forgiveness equal to the amount spent by the borrower during an 8-week period after the origination date of the loan. So that answers that question. It has to be paid during 8 weeks on payroll costs. Remember, we defined what payroll costs are for both the origination side of how much you can receive. Now you're going to use that same definition for the how much you can spend to get it forgiven. To Matt's point, spend it on whatever you want, right? But if you, for business purposes, of course, but if you want it forgiven on the back end, this is the form. This is what you want to meet this test. So spend it on payroll costs, including benefits, capped at $100,000 per employee. Remember, we had that FAQ that said that certain benefits do not get included into that 100,000. They are above that. So for purposes of originating the loan for a maximum amount, you get more than that 100. And for purposes of forgiveness on the back end, you could spend it on more than 100,000 because you could spend it on those benefits. Interest payment on any mortgages incurred prior to February 15th, 2020, rent or lease enforced prior to Feb 15th, 2020, and payments on utilities, which service began for prior to Feb 15, 2020. That's basically the test of how you get this forgiven. That's how you have to spend this money on these eligible expenses, and that's how you get it forgiven. Now, there are a couple tests on the back end to how to get this forgiven beyond the eligible expenses that you're going to spend it on. So to get the money forgiven, it has to be spent on payroll costs or those other eligible expenses. However, there are also two other big tests that you have to meet. One is reduction based on number of employees. That's the header of this slide. And the next one is reduction relating to salary and wages, which is going to be the next slide, but we'll get there in a second. So basically, there's a formula. Let's go back 1 second, Bill. Basically, there's a formula that goes into this, which how do you figure out the loan forgiveness? So loan forgiveness is reduced where a business doesn't maintain the average number of full-time employees per month when compared to certain periods of time. So basically, the whole point of this, if you think big picture from a policy perspective, this is supposed to be giving money to businesses not to lay off people. And if the government's giving you that money and you want it forgiven, then you have to make sure you maintain the same number of full-time equivalents as in certain test periods. What are those test periods? A and B, either February 15th, the average number of full-time equivalent employees per month. So remember, full-time equivalent could be, you had people that were working, 25% full-time, 4 people as well as a 1-person equivalent or 1-person equivalent or 1 full-time person working thereafter. But the point is, it's about the equivalence of full-time per month employed by the eligible recipient during the period beginning on Feb 15, 2019 and through June 30th, 2019. So that's your test period. You're going to look back at that and see if your current FTEs, full-time equivalents, when you're asking for forgiveness during that 8-week period of time that you're spending it on, did they equal at least the FTEs, the full-time equivalents that you had back in that period of time? Or you can choose a different period of time, January 1, 2020 to February 29th, 2020. So there's 2 different test periods that you can use. So seasonal employers, loan forgiveness is determined by the average number of FTEs per month employed by the recipient during the period beginning on Feb 15, ending on June 30th of 2019. So that goes to the don't decrease your full-time equivalents for purposes of determining what the forgiveness amount is. Now, if you do go below that, if you do decrease it, it doesn't mean that your whole loan will not be forgiven. It just means that it's going to be reduced pro rata for the amount of full-time equivalents that you did not keep on. So again, it's not like a full bar. Oh, I messed up. I'm 0.1, 10% of an equivalent under. I'm going to not get anything forgiven. No, it's going to be pro rata, and it's going to be throttled back, the forgiveness. But it's not that it's not going to be forgiven at all. Matt, I see you have something to say.
Right. Yeah. I just wanted to. There was a question that popped up and said, "What about companies that had to lay off employees?" And I think some of the misconceptions about this program is that it was going to help these businesses that had to close, right? Retail businesses and other restaurants and things where they actually closed or significantly reduced their staff. And while you can borrow the money at a favorable rate, the forgiveness is going to be the challenge there. Because if if the business owner and some management stay on, you can have a portion of it forgiven. But this program is really not meant to address that specific situation where a business either entirely shuttered or laid off a substantial amount of its employees. And I think that that's a little bit of I don't know if that was made abundantly clear when this was being negotiated, but the practical reality is it really doesn't, I don't want to say it doesn't help, but it's not going to be a forgivable loan in that context. It's going to be just a low interest rate loan.
Correct. It's a good point, Matt. So for businesses that are totally not operating anymore, so for purposes of determining your full-time equivalents in the past, right, if you bring everybody back up online and working, that couple months, that you had them offline for purposes of determining your test period of how many full-time equivalents. If you look here, the test period it ends February 2019, 2020 under B, or you can use June 30th, 2019. So that layoff that recently happened shouldn't affect the full-time equivalents that you have today if you bring them all back online, but you will have to pay the FICA, right? Because you can't borrow that amount of money and you can't use the loan to pay the FICA and have it forgiven. So that's some consideration there, that if you're going to bring everybody back online and you're shut down and there's no revenue coming in, that you should consider that you're still going to have out-of-pocket expenses with respect to those employees to be able to cover their FICA. Glenn, did you have something to say, or just?
No, I was going to answer one of the questions. Question as to whether an S corp owner could get credit for the W-2 wages he pays to himself, and the answer to that is that's correct. They would only get credit for the W-2 wages themselves. None of the profits of the S corporation would they get credit for, but the W-2 portion, they would get credit for the loan amount and also credit for the forgiveness on this program.
Yeah, that's a great idea, guys. So as I'm going through this, I'm having a hard time navigating the questions. So if you guys want to read them and think of some answers and throw them out there, please feel free to interrupt me as I go through. So that's basically, so remember, there's three things to get the loan forgiven. There's the orange part on the left slide there, which is basically spend it on qualifying expenses. Then there's the two tests of reduction based on number of employees, where it's prorated back the amount of forgiveness based on full-time equivalents. And then the next slide, which we're going to go to now, Bill.
And Eli, I'll grab another question while you're there.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Morgan, there's no restriction on charging your clients for idle documents. You just have to disclose that to the SBA what your fee is, and that's in the application itself. But for the PPP program, there is a prohibition of filling out the application and charging unless you're an agent working for the bank, and that's part of the CARES Act. But the idle program, you're free to charge your clients for filling out those forms.
Okay, great. So now moving on to the second test for forgiveness is reduction relating to salary and wages. So when you think about forgiveness, it's going to be maintaining a similar full-time equivalent for purposes of forgiveness, and there's also going to be a reduction relating to salaries and wages. So the amount of loan that's forgiven is reduced by the amount of any reduction in total salary or wages of any employee during the covered period in excess of 25% of the total salary or wages of the employee during the recent full quarter the employee was employed prior to coverage. So essentially what that means, it's a lot of words, but it essentially just means that you can't cut people's salary by more than 25% in order to receive full forgiveness on the back end. So that's something to take into consideration. Now, if you do cut them, let's say 10%, then you may want to consider how that impacts your ability to use the full amount of the PPP loan, which you computed off of almost 100% of someone's pay times 2.5, right? So in order to be forgiven, you're going to want to model it out to see what it looks like for purposes of paying your employees. If you do reduce their salaries, will there be any money left over after you've paid rent and other expenses that are allowed? And if you expended 75% on payroll, then is there any money left over that might not be forgiven if you reduce them back? So, I'll turn everybody to the law. I mean, the law, it's in the forgiveness section of the law, which I believe is section 1106 that I have here up on the screen. And it basically excludes anybody who makes over $100,000 for purposes of this throttle back. So unclear whether that's $100,000 up to $100,000 that they have to make that you can't cut their salary by, or if someone who makes over $100,000 salary can be cut even 25%, and that would not be a fatal flaw to this. So a lot of information on the forgiveness side is going to be coming out. I believe it'll be forthcoming. I think there'll be more guidance out there. Right now, a lot of people are focusing a lot on, well, how much can I borrow? And then I'll figure out how to spend it when the money actually comes to the door. There's enough of a framework here to figure this out, but there are some questions about people who earn more than 100,000 and how they're impacted by this 25% reduction in compensation. Next slide.
Yeah, Eli, I'll jump in. Just a couple general questions that I've seen pop up several times has anybody missed the time to file for this program yet? If you have W-2 wages,
There's a slide
it
right
opened
there.
last Friday, but it is still ongoing. The only limitation is going to be when the money runs out, and everybody fully expects that the money is going to run out fairly quickly, but it looks like there will be more. And another question that's popped up several times is with respect to sole proprietors and independent contractors. To be clear, the program began last Friday for companies with W-2 wages, and this Friday it will begin for sole proprietors and contractors. And last week, the guidance from the Treasury came out, I believe it was Tuesday night or Wednesday, with respect to the program that opened last Friday. So we expect some guidance any moment now, talking a little bit more about the program that's going to begin this Friday for companies without W-2 wages. So that was just a question that had popped up several times. That's the program that begins this Friday. Same structure, but just there's going to be some different calculations with wages.
Right, and that's a really good point, Matt. And that goes to if someone is self-employed, Schedule C, sole proprietorship, and has payroll, makes payroll. I think that their individual net income in last Friday is not going to be, the last Friday's program. Sorry, a question just popped up that distracted me. But if last Friday's program is not going to include that net income of that sole proprietor, but this coming Friday would, however, we're not sure how that's going to interplay with payroll, whether it's going to be their net income plus the payroll they're paying, or is it just going to be their net income, or should you file last Friday with just their payroll expense information and they'll get less of a loan because they're not going to get anything based on their net income. So that's unclear. We just don't know yet, and we're waiting for guidance on that information. So as you see in this slide, I think Matt just hit that right on the nose. And it's April 3rd already open for businesses with payroll expense. April 10th, this Friday, opening for independent contractors, self-employed individuals as well. Contact your bank first. I mean, that's a really good point. Essentially, banks are dealing with their clients on a first-come, first-served basis, and they're dealing with clients they have existing relationships with, and that's a lot of the big banks. A lot of the smaller community banks are taking on other people. My concern with a lot of these smaller community banks are they well-staffed to be able to take a flood of applications for people they don't have an existing relationship with? And I think that's part of the concern. Do they take these applications? Are they going to process them fast enough? Will the money run out when it's sitting on the desk of the community bank? I don't know. And I think those are some legitimate concerns that people might have with respect to where to apply through. Let's go on the next slide. So the next few slides, talking about Matt actually made a really good point, saying we fully expect the money to run out. Well, looks like the money's run out on these next few slides. So we've heard I believe yesterday at 5 o'clock. Next slide, please, Bill. The Department of Commerce had two essential benefits on the Maryland level. One was a $10,000 grant and one was a $50,000 loan. The terms of which are in here, but I'm not going to go into great detail because yesterday at 5 o'clock, I believe that closed is what we hear. So they're not accepting any more applications for the grants or for the loans through the Maryland Department of Commerce. So this is largely out there. Just so you know, and you're situationally aware, just like on the federal side, we're anticipating, though nobody really knows, that there's going to be more money that'll be thrown into this program, the PPP program. We don't know what Maryland's going to do. Here are the basic bones and outline of these programs so that you have them in the event Maryland makes this live again and you wanted to know a little bit about what was available. And then next slide, please, Bill. Next slide, Bill. Thanks. This is also another program that, as far as I've heard, I think this one got exhausted pretty early on. Glenn, I think you may have mentioned that to me through hearing it through someone else, that the layoff aversion fund, I think, is already tapped out, correct?
Yeah, there was only $9 million in that fund, and it went within a couple of days.
And that was a $50,000 loan as well, but that went. So basically, you can ignore these slides largely. They're there just in case this goes back live and you wanted to take a quick peek at some of the highlights so you're aware of what this program was. And if it does come back live, you can go and get in and grab it quick, because it did get exhausted very quickly. And I have not heard anybody who actually received the money yet. I think they're just inundated with requests. I haven't heard anybody who actually received the grants, the 10,000 grant or the loan, but that sounds like the same story on the federal side. I think they were just inundated. These are largely popular programs, and we're waiting to actually hear anecdotal evidence that people received money, just so we can guide our clients as to timing. A lot of businesses are really suffering, and they want to know, do I lay them off now, or am I going to be able to make my next payroll? And that's a really tough question that we can't answer right now. Next slide. Matt, you want to cover some unemployment benefits generally?
Sure, I'll just do this briefly. As in response to this pandemic, the unemployment benefits were expanded in three ways. The first, it was who could receive unemployment benefits: self-employed, independent contractors, gig workers, and importantly, people without sufficient work history are now able to apply for unemployment benefits. I know the Maryland website, I believe, is now taking applications. They were not set up to do that initially, but they are now. The second way that it was expanded was the amount. The federal government, it's made well known, it was in the press a lot, added a $600 a week benefit on top of the state benefit that you would receive. And then lastly, it's the length of time. So they added 13 weeks to the unemployment benefit. So this really is more applicable to the companies that we talked about before, where they're essentially shut. And hopefully a lot of those workers are going to be taken care of with these unemployment benefits, and they'll be able to take advantage of that program.
Thanks, Matt. And I think one of the questions I'm live. Okay, good. One of the questions that I see asked here, and I think, is there a next slide, Bill, or is it just our faces? Yep, well, that's just our practice areas. But beyond that, okay, that's just us. Okay, well, so for purposes, I think we have a few minutes left. Glenn, Matt, do you have any questions that you want to answer here? I'm trying to cover these. Will you be doing a webinar to cover information will be released this Friday? Certainly, we can give that a shot. Once the information comes out, we can try to update this and maybe do a quick update with respect to some of the new rules that are coming out for self-employed or sole props. We're certainly not averse to doing that. We'd be glad to chip in and do that.
Here's one. What if you have both W-2 employees and owner draws? Again, you're only going to get credit for the loan amount and for the forgiveness for the W-2 payroll. It's not going to be owner draws likely that you get credit for. However, it's interesting because right now there's a disparity between general partnerships and sole proprietorships. It's clear sole proprietorships are going to get credit for their net income, but as of yet, they have not put guidance out on profits from general partners and how they're going to treat that, if that's going to be included self-employment wages or not.
And I believe for purposes of, one is a nonprofit question, I think the 501c3 is in the bill for purposes of being eligible to receive the PPP loan. Glenn, you covered the owner draw. Can you reimburse yourself for rent, payroll, and other covered expenses prior to funding March rent, payroll? I don't think so. I think if you accrued it, there might be an argument there that if you have accrued the expense and have not yet paid it because you can't, such as rent, that perhaps you can pay it as long as it's during that covered 8-week period, but not pay yourself back for rent that you've paid before the loan was originated. And I think that's how I would think about it. Glenn, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. The law talked about the obligation had to be in existence at February 15th, 2020. So any leases signed before that date, you're eligible to get that rent forgiven. They're going to put out additional guidance. If you've accrued your rent, not been able to pay your landlord, there will be additional guidance whether you can that accrued rent get credit for.
right? So looking at some other questions here. So essentially the loan money is going to come in, and then that loan money is going to be available to be able to pay payroll expenses. I saw a question just recently come in. But that's essentially how you think about where's the money going to come from to be able to pay people. It's once that loan money comes in, you'll use that loan money for 8 weeks of operations. And then after that, we'll see if there's a second round or a second tier for either people who weren't able to get it the first time or people who need more money because we're going to have to be shut down for a longer period of time. And I think that's currently unknown. It's literally one day at a time, trying to iron out the issues on the front end of that application. There will be a tremendous amount more information coming out, I assume, on the Friday program. But beyond that, we're at the application stage. Lots and lots of questions on the application stage. The forgiveness stage, lots of questions too. Some of them were already answered through the definition of payroll costs and information coming out in the FAQs, but more information to come. I think I speak for on behalf of all of us. We're all looking forward to doing another webinar with some updates, like a 2.0 of this, when more information comes out on the forgiveness side. I think this is going to be with us for a long time. It'll be with us on the forgiveness side. It'll be with us on the back end for a while, and there'll be a lot of questions. The bank doesn't want to forgive my loan. What happens with respect to all of this and some of the nuanced information that's going to go into the forgiveness side. But we'll go ahead and do another webinar when it comes out. I'm happy to do it. So I think that brings us to 2:30. I don't want to hold anybody back here.
And we posted a link for these slides on our website. It's askfrost.com/MSBA-webinar. And feel free to contact
Can you repeat
myself.
that, Glenn? Can you repeat that?
One more time. I'm sorry.
Yep.
askfrost.com/MSBA-webinar. And I posted that in our chat section. So you can just scroll through the chat section and you'll see where I posted that link. And feel free to contact either myself, Eli, or Matt. We're happy to take any questions that anybody has offline.
All right.
Okay. Well, thank you. This is Andrea Terry with the Maryland State Bar Association. And on behalf of the taxation section, we thank Glenn and the team that you've assembled today, Janice Shee with the Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service, Matt Kreuter and Eli Knopf, partners with Glenn at Frost Law. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to join us. We have posted a slide with some evaluation questions. We are always interested in your feedback, so please go ahead and send that feedback to the email address posted, chriselle@msba.org. Glenn mentioned that he posted a link in the chat section to his slides for this presentation. And so if anybody has trouble accessing those, just let us know at the same email address. And thank you again for joining us today for this presentation. And thank you to the taxation section and Glenn and your team.
Thank you.
Take care.
Everybody have a good day.
Good one. Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye-bye.